Have you ever really stopped to think about what it actually takes to prove a crime has been committed? I mean, on the surface, it seems pretty simple, right? But in the eyes of the law, oh, it is a fascinating puzzle. Today, we're going to dive into one of the most fundamental pieces of that puzzle, the guilty act. So let me just ask you this, straight up. Can you be punished for just a thought? Seriously, if you think about committing a crime, maybe you even plan it out in your head, but you don't do anything. Have you broken the law? Well, that question gets right to the heart of what we're talking about today, this critical difference between a guilty mind and a guilty act. All right, so let's start with the absolute bedrock of any crime, the physical component. You have to understand, without a physical act, it doesn't matter what somebody was thinking. There just can't be a crime. Now, the fancy legal term for this is actus reus. It's Latin, of course, for guilty act, and it refers to the physical action, or sometimes, and this is important, the failure to act that actually makes up the crime. The bottom line is this. Every single criminal case has to have an actus reus. It is absolutely non-negotiable. You know, you can almost think of it like a simple recipe. Most crimes have two essential ingredients. On one side, you've got the actus reus, that's the guilty act. And on the other, you've got the mens rea, another Latin phrase, this one for guilty mind. That's the mental part, the intention. And to prove a crime, you almost always need to have both. So this brings us to a really crucial point. A guilty mind all by itself is never enough. And honestly, there is no better way to show this than with a very, very strange but true case from 1952. It involves a guy who was, well, an accidental truth teller. Okay, so the story starts with this defendant who fully 100% intended to commit fraud. He was selling his car, and his whole plan was to lie to the buyer to get the sale done. His mind? Definitely guilty. So he goes to the buyer and he tells him, point blank, that there are no outstanding debts on the car. Now, he was totally convinced this was a flat-out lie because he'd taken out a loan, what the court called a mortgage, against the car. This was his big moment, his attempt at the guilty act. But here is where the story takes a turn. What the seller had no idea about was that the loan agreement he'd taken out was, for technical legal reasons, completely void. It legally didn't even exist. So, in this incredible moment of pure irony, his statement, the one he thought was a lie, that there were no debts on the car, was actually literally 100% true. He tried to lie, but he just couldn't. He accidentally told the truth. And that's exactly what the court found. Sure, he clearly had the mens rea, the guilty mind, no doubt about it, but he hadn't actually committed the actus reus. He didn't make a false statement, and because of that, no crime was committed. He couldn't be found guilty. This case just perfectly splits that hair between the thought and the act. Okay, but it's not just about doing something. The law adds another really important layer here. For an act to be a crime, it has to be voluntary. So what in the world happens when your body acts, but your mind isn't calling the shots? This definition from a big case back in 1963 just says it all. An involuntary act is one done by the muscles without any control by the mind. It's basically an action without any conscious will behind it. And the law is crystal clear on this. You can't be punished for an act if it's done involuntarily. So what does that actually look like? Well, the court gave some pretty clear examples. Think about a muscle spasm that makes you hit someone, or a reflex action, or something you do during a convulsion. A classic example is an act you do while you're unconscious, say after you get a concussion. Imagine a rugby player who takes a huge hit, is technically unconscious, but his body keeps running and he tackles someone. That action, it's not voluntary, so it can't be a criminal act. So far, we've kind of treated the act and the intent like two separate boxes you have to check off. But you know, it's not always that neat and tidy. Let's look at a crime where that line between the physical act and the mental state gets really blurry. Let's talk about burglary. See, the crime of burglary isn't just about trespassing. The physical act, the actus reus, is entering a building as a trespasser. But, and this is the key, that act only becomes the actus reus for burglary when it's paired with a very specific mens rea at that exact same moment, the intent to steal something once you're inside. So just stop and think about what this means for a second. Simply trespassing isn't burglary. The physical act of walking into that building is only transformed into the guilty act of burglary because of what's going on in the person's head right then and there. In this case, the guilty act and the guilty mind are completely wrapped up in each other. And that leaves us with a really fascinating final question, doesn't it? We started out by saying you can't be punished for just a thought. But now we've seen that sometimes the physical act is actually defined by the thought behind it. So if the act isn't always enough on its own, and the intent can be woven into the very fabric of the act, how do we ever draw a perfect line to define what truly makes something a crime?